My name is Emma, and I'm about to tell you a story that will make you question everything you think you know about the people closest to you. 3 months ago, I thought I had married into the most loving, wholesome family imaginable. My father-in-law, Walter, was everyone's favorite grandpa. The kind of man who helped neighbors fix their cars, donated to every charity, and never missed his grandchildren's school plays. But sometimes, the people who seem the most innocent are hiding the darkest secrets. Perfect family facade about to crumble. I met my husband David 5 years ago at a coffee shop downtown. He was reading a book about World War II history while sipping black coffee, and something about his gentle demeanor drew me in. When I finally met his family, I understood where that gentleness came from. Walter, his 78-year-old father, was the embodiment of kindness. Always ready with a warm smile, a corny joke, and the best homemade apple pie I'd ever tasted. Walter had been widowed for 10 years, but he never let loneliness make him bitter. Instead, he channeled all his love into his family and community. He volunteered at the local food bank, coached Little League baseball, and had become a surrogate grandfather to half the neighborhood kids. If stories of hidden family secrets and shocking discoveries keep you up at night, hit that subscribe button now, because what I found in that attic will haunt your dreams. David and I married 2 years ago in Walter's backyard, with him officiating the ceremony after getting ordained online, just for us. It was perfect, intimate, loving, and filled with a warmth that seemed to radiate from this amazing man who had welcomed me as his own daughter. But 3 months ago, Walter suffered a massive heart attack while working in his garden. By the time the paramedics arrived, he was gone. Our family was devastated. We've lost not just a father and grandfather, but the moral compass that had guided us all. The beloved patriarch dies, setting stage for discovery. The inheritance and discovery, 2 to 4 minutes. Walter left his house to David, along with specific instructions about what to do with his belongings. Most items were to be donated to charity, but there were personal effects he wanted kept in the family. The house was old, built in the 1940s, and filled with decades of memories, photographs, and what seemed like perfectly normal possessions of a man who had lived a long, good life. The cleaning process was emotional. Every room held memories of family dinners, birthday celebrations, and quiet evenings spent listening to Walter's stories about the old days. He'd always been somewhat vague about his childhood and early adult life, saying only that he'd traveled a lot before settling down and starting his family. It was David's sister Karen who suggested we tackle the attic last. Dad never let anyone up there, she said. He always claimed it was just old junk and Christmas decorations, but maybe there are photo albums or family documents we should preserve. The attic access was through a pull-down ladder in the hallway ceiling. As I climbed up with a flashlight, the first thing that struck me was how organized everything was. This wasn't the cluttered storage space of an elderly man. It was methodically arranged, with labeled boxes, filing cabinets, and what appeared to be a small office area in the far corner. The organized attic. This isn't random storage. Walter had been meticulous about everything in his life, so the organization wasn't initially surprising. But as I began examining the contents, I realized that none of these boxes contained Christmas decorations or family photos. Instead, I found documents, hundreds of them, all carefully filed and preserved. The first box I opened contained what appeared to be identification documents, passports, driver's licenses, and birth certificates. But something was wrong. The photos were all of Walter, but the names were different. Wilhelm Hartmann, William Harris, Walt Henderson, all with different birth dates, all from different states. My hands were shaking as I opened the second box. More documents, but these were older, much older, and they weren't in English. Multiple identities discovered. Who is Walter, really? I don't speak German, but I recognize the language from my college courses. The documents appear to be official papers from the 1940s, with Nazi eagles and swastikas on the letterhead. My blood ran cold as I realized what I was looking at. Among the germ documents, I found photographs. Not family photos, but official portraits of men in Nazi uniforms. And in several of these photos, despite the uniform and the 70 years that had passed, I recognized a face that had smiled at me across countless dinner tables. Walter, or rather, the man I had known as Walter. But the name on the documents wasn't Walter Matthews, the kind grandfather who had walked me down the aisle when my own father couldn't attend my wedding. The name was Wilhelm Hartmann, and according to these papers, he had been a guard at Auschwitz concentration camp. Nazi documents found, Walter was a concentration camp guard. I dropped the flashlight, and it rolled across the attic floor, casting dancing shadows across what I was beginning to realize was evidence of one of the most monstrous deceptions I could imagine. The man who had taught Sunday school, who had donated thousands of dollars to Holocaust memorials, who had tears in his eyes every time he watched a World War II documentary, had been on the other side of history. But that wasn't the worst of it. As I continued searching through the documents, I found evidence that Wilhelm's activities during the war had been far more extensive than just standing guard. There were commendations, transfer orders, and most horrifyingly, detailed reports written in his own handwriting describing the processing of prisoners. The clinical language he used to describe the systematic murder of innocent people was almost more chilling than the acts themselves. This wasn't a young man who had been drafted and forced into service. These documents showed someone who had volunteered, someone who had been promoted, someone who had been trusted with increasingly important responsibilities in the Nazi death machine. I found myself hyperventilating in that dusty attic, surrounded by evidence that the man who had been my father figure for 5 years had participated in genocide. But I forced myself to keep looking because I needed to understand the full scope of what I had discovered. The discovery gets worse. Walter was a willing participant in genocide. The next set of documents told the story of Wilhelm's escape from Germany after the war ended. Unlike many Nazi war criminals who fled through established ratlands to South America, Wilhelm had apparently planned his own escape route through a network of sympathizers in the American military. I found forged discharge papers showing him as an American soldier, complete with a fabricated service record that painted him as a hero who had been captured and held prisoner by the Nazis. The attention to detail was stunning. Medical records showing injuries consistent with torture, testimonials from fellow prisoners vouching for his character, and even letters supposedly written from the prisoner of war camp. But the most chilling part of this deception was how he had used the very atrocities he had participated in to create his cover story. Wilhelm had intimate knowledge of the concentration camp system because he had worked in it, and he used that knowledge to craft a believable narrative about being a victim rather than a perpetrator. The documents showed that he had arrived in the United States in 1947, just 2 years after the war ended. He had been welcomed as a war hero, given veterans benefits, and helped to integrate into American society by people who believed they were assisting a Holocaust survivor. Walter used his knowledge of the camps to pose as a victim. I found employment records showing how Wilhelm had quickly established himself in his new identity. He had worked at various jobs, construction, factory work, eventually opening a small business, all while maintaining his cover as Walter Matthews, American war hero and Holocaust survivor. But what made my stomach turn was discovering that he hadn't just hidden his past, he had actively profited from it. I found correspondence with Holocaust survivor organizations, documentation showing that he had received reparation payments meant for actual victims of Nazi persecution, and given evidence that he had given speeches at schools and community centers about his experiences in the concentration camps. The man who had sat at our dinner table telling stories about the importance of fighting hatred and prejudice had been stealing money meant for the people he had helped victimize. He had built his entire American life on the suffering of the very people he had tormented. But the documents in that attic revealed an even more disturbing truth. Wilhelm hadn't just escaped and assumed a new identity. He had continued his activities in America, connecting with other Nazi war criminals who had also successfully infiltrated American society. Walter wasn't alone. There was a whole network of Nazi war criminals. Among Walter's papers, I found correspondence with dozens of other men who had clearly gone through similar identity transformations. The letters were in code, using innocent-sounding language about old friends from the war and reunions. But the context made it clear that these were Nazi war criminals who had maintained contact with each other throughout the decades. Some letters contained what appeared to be financial transactions. Money being moved between accounts, investments being made, properties being purchased. As I pieced together the information, I realized that these men had created an informal network to help each other succeed in their new lives while maintaining their Nazi ideologies in secret. There were photographs from gatherings that looked like innocent retirement parties or family barbecues, but when I examined them closely, I could see Nazi memorabilia subtly displayed in the backgrounds. These weren't men who had abandoned their beliefs. They were men who had learned to hide them while continuing to support each other and, presumably, their cause. But the most disturbing discovery was a journal that Wilhelm had kept throughout his American life. Written in German and hidden behind false backs in his filing cabinets, it documented not just his continued Nazi beliefs, but his satisfaction at having deceived everyone around him for decades. A secret journal reveals Walter's continued Nazi beliefs and satisfaction at deceiving everyone. The journal entries were written sporadically over the years, but they painted a picture of a man who had never truly repented or changed. He wrote about watching his son grow up while knowing that if David ever learned the truth, he would be horrified. He wrote about attending Holocaust memorial services and fighting back laughter during the testimonials of actual survivors. Most chillingly, he wrote about the thrill he got from being praised for his courage in surviving the concentration camps, knowing that he had been on the other side of the barbed wire. He described the exquisite irony of receiving reparation payments while knowing that he had been the one causing the harm that deserved reparations. But it was his entries about our family that made me physically ill. He had written about me, about how easy it had been to win my trust and affection. He had written about David's children, Walter's grandchildren, and a satisfaction at knowing that his bloodline would continue while his victims had been cut short. The final entries, written just months before his death, revealed that he had been planning to pass on his true history to someone he trusted. He had been looking for a way to ensure that his story, the real story, would be preserved, even if he couldn't tell it openly. Walter planned to pass on his true story, but to whom? As I sat in the attic, surrounded by evidence of decades of deception, I realized that I was facing an impossible situation. The man who had been like a father to me, who had been David's hero and role model, who had been beloved by an entire community, was a monster who had successfully hidden his true nature for over 70 years. But the implications went far beyond just learning about Walter's past. I had to consider what this meant for my husband, my marriage, and my family's future. David had based his entire moral framework on his father's example. He had chosen his career in social work because Walter had taught him about the importance of helping others. He had raised his children to be kind and generous because that's what his father had modeled. How do you tell someone that everything they believe about their most important relationship is a lie? How do you destroy not just their memory of a beloved parent, but their entire understanding of themselves and their family? The impossible choice: destroy the family with the truth or carry the burden alone. I spent 3 hours in that attic, reading through document after document, try to find some piece of evidence that would make this all make sense in a way that wasn't completely devastating. Maybe Walter had been coerced. Maybe he had been trying to make amends. Maybe there was some explanation that could reconcile the man I had known with the monster these documents revealed. But there wasn't. If anything, the more I read, the clearer it became that Walter had never felt genuine remorse for his actions. He had simply been intelligent and calculating enough to create a perfect disguise that allowed him to live comfortably while never facing consequences for his crimes. The journal entries made it clear that he had enjoyed the deception. He had taken pleasure in being seen as a victim rather than a perpetrator. He had found satisfaction in the fact that people who would have been horrified by his true actions instead loved and respected him. As I finally prepared to leave the attic, I discovered one final box that I had initially overlooked. Inside, I found something that made everything infinitely worse. Recent documents showing that Walter had been in contact with Holocaust deniers and neo-Nazi groups, providing them with information to support their claims that the Holocaust had been exaggerated or fabricated. Walter had been working with modern Holocaust deniers and neo-Nazis. The recent documents revealed that Wilhelm had spent his final years contributing to Holocaust denial efforts, using his insider knowledge to help modern neo-Nazis craft more convincing arguments against historical truth. He had been corresponding with websites, authors, and activists who were working to minimize or deny Nazi atrocities. But his contribution wasn't just ideological, it was practical. He had been providing detailed information about concentration camp operations, helping Holocaust deniers identify inconsistencies in survivor testimonies or historical accounts. Since he actually knew how the camps had operated, he could help deniers craft arguments that would be harder for historians to immediately debunk. The cruelest part was that he had been using his reputation as a Holocaust survivor to give credibility to these efforts. He had written testimonials for Holocaust denial websites, presenting himself as someone who had been there and could testify that the official accounts were exaggerated. I found emails showing that he had been planning to reveal his true identity after his death, intending to create a final, devastating blow to Holocaust education and remembrance. His plan was to have his story published posthumously, complete with documentation proving that even supposed survivors were actually Nazi guards, thereby casting doubt on all Holocaust testimony. Walter's final plan was to use his death to damage Holocaust education and remembrance. The sophistication of his long-term planning was terrifying. He had spent decades building up his reputation as a model citizen and Holocaust survivor specifically so that his eventual revelation would have maximum impact. He had calculated that his story would be so shocking, beloved community leader revealed as Nazi war criminal, that would make people question all Holocaust education. But as I read through his correspondence with modern Nazi sympathizers, I realized that Walter's plan had a fatal flaw. He had assumed that someone would find his documents and follow through with his wishes to publish his story. He had been grooming several people in the neo-Nazi community to serve as his literary executors, but he hadn't counted on his family discovering the truth first. I now held in my hands not just evidence of Walter's crimes, but proof of an ongoing conspiracy to undermine historical truth and Holocaust education. The question was, what was I going to do with this information? Emma must choose between protecting her family and exposing the truth. I climbed down from that attic carrying the weight of a secret that would destroy everyone I loved. But I also carried the responsibility of knowledge that could prevent Walter's final act of evil from succeeding. Over the following days, I struggled with the most difficult decision of my life. I could destroy the documents, take Walter's secrets to my grave, and allow my family to continue living with their cherished memories of a man who had never actually existed. David would never know that his moral foundation was built on a lie. Our children would never learn that their beloved grandfather had been a Nazi war criminal. But that choice would also mean allowing Walter's modern conspirators to continue their work without being exposed. It would mean letting Holocaust deniers continue to spread lies without knowing that they had been collaborating with an actual Nazi who had been deceiving everyone, including them. The weight of decision. Family peace versus historical justice. I considered taking the evidence to authorities, but what would that accomplish? Walter was dead. Most of his Nazi collaborators mentioned in the documents were probably dead too. The legal system couldn't prosecute a corpse, and exposing his crimes would only serve to destroy the lives of innocent family members who had known nothing about his true identity. But then I thought about all the Holocaust survivors I had met at the memorial services Walter had attended. I thought about the families who were still searching for information about relatives who had died in the camps where Walter had worked. I thought about the students who had listened to Walter's fabricated stories about surviving Nazi persecution, never knowing they were being lied to by one of the perpetrators. For 2 weeks, I carried this burden alone, watching my husband grieve for a father who had never actually existed, seeing my children miss a grandfather who had been living a lie their entire lives. The stress was overwhelming. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, and found myself constantly on the verge of either confessing everything or destroying all the evidence. But then I made a discovery that changed everything and forced my hand. A final discovery forces Emma's hand. While going through Walter's computer files to handle his digital affairs, I found encrypted folders that I initially couldn't access. But David had helped his father set up the computer, and he remembered Walter's password patterns. When we finally opened the encrypted files, we found something that made it impossible for me to remain silent. Walter had been documenting the current addresses and family information of Holocaust survivors and their descendants. He had compiled a database of people who had testified at war crimes trials, written memoirs about their experiences, or worked with Holocaust education organizations. But this wasn't just an academic exercise. His correspondence with neo-Nazi groups revealed that this information was being used to harass, intimidate, and threaten Holocaust survivors and their families. Walter had spent years gathering intelligence that was being used to terrorize elderly people who had already suffered unimaginable trauma. Walter had been helping to harass and intimidate Holocaust survivors. The most recent files showed that this harassment campaign was still active and ongoing. Walter's death had disrupted their operations, but his contacts were working to continue the project. They were trying to access his complete database, and some were suggesting that they approach his family members to see if anyone could help them retrieve his research. I realized that my silence wouldn't just be protecting my family. It would be enabling the continued persecution of Holocaust survivors. By keeping Walter's secrets, I would become complicit in ongoing crimes against some of the most vulnerable people in our society. That night, I made my decision. I couldn't allow Walter's legacy of evil to continue, even if exposing it would destroy my family's peace forever. Emma decides to expose everything. But how do you destroy your family with the truth? I scheduled a family meeting for the following weekend, telling David only that I had found some disturbing information while cleaning out his father's house. I didn't sleep for the entire week leading up to that conversation, rehearsing different ways to break news that would shatter everything my husband believed about his life. When the day came, I gathered David, his sister Karen, and their spouses in Walter's living room, the same room where we had celebrated holidays, birthdays, and anniversaries for the past 5 years. I had prepared copies of the most damning documents, though I had left the most graphic materials at home. I started by explaining that I had found evidence that Walter had been living under a false identity, that his real name was Wilhelm Hartmann, and that he had served in the Nazi military during World War II. I watched as confusion, then disbelief, then horror crossed their faces. David's first reaction was denial. "That's impossible, Emma. Dad was a Holocaust survivor. He had the tattoo numbers. He had nightmares about the camps his entire life." The family confrontation, denial, disbelief, and horror. But I had prepared for this reaction. I showed them the German documents with Wilhelm's photograph, the false identification papers, the journal entries describing his deception. Most convincingly, I showed them the recent correspondence with Holocaust deniers, written in Walter's unmistakable handwriting. Karen broke down crying when she saw the evidence that their father had been collecting information on Holocaust survivors for the purpose of harassment. "He used to cry every year on Holocaust Remembrance Day," she sobbed. "He donated money to survivor organizations. How could he have been faking all of that?" I explained about the reparation payments Walter had fraudulently collected, the speeches he had given at schools while knowing he was lying to children, the network of other Nazi war criminals he had maintained contact with throughout his life. But the hardest part was showing them the journal entries about her family, how Walter had written about the amusing irony of being loved by people who would hate him if they knew the truth, how he had taken pleasure in deceiving us all, how he had viewed his successful deception as a victory over his enemies. The family must decide what to do with this devastating knowledge. The following months were the most difficult of our lives. David went through a complete emotional breakdown, questioning not just his memories of his father, but his entire sense of identity. If the man who had been his moral role model was actually a Nazi war criminal, what did that say about David's own character and judgment? We decided as a family to turn over all of Walter's documents to the FBI and to Holocaust research organizations. We wanted to ensure that his database of survivor information couldn't be used to harm anyone, and we felt that historians should have access to his papers for research purposes. The investigation that followed revealed that Walter's case was not unique. There were dozens of Nazi war criminals who had successfully infiltrated American society using similar methods, and some of them were still alive and living under false identities. This story reveals a larger truth about hidden Nazi war criminals in America. But perhaps the most important outcome was that we were able to prevent Walter's final act of evil from succeeding. The Holocaust denial groups he had been working with lost a key source of intelligence and credibility when his true identity was exposed. Instead of casting doubt on Holocaust education, his story became a powerful reminder of how Nazi war criminals had continued their work through deception and manipulation. David and I are still married, though our relationship has been forever changed by what we learned. We've had to rebuild our family's moral foundation from scratch, teaching our children about the importance of questioning authority, verifying information, and understanding that evil can hide behind the most convincing masks. The house we inherited from Walter has been donated to a Holocaust education organization, and we've used our story to help train investigators who are still working to identify Nazi war criminals living under false identities. The lesson from this nightmare is simple but crucial. Evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes, the most dangerous people are those who have learned to perfectly mimic goodness while harboring hatred in their hearts. Trust your instincts, ask difficult questions, and remember that a person's public persona might be completely different from their private reality. The man I called Grandpa for 5 years was never the person I thought I knew. But by exposing his secrets, we prevented him from continuing to cause harm, even after his death. Sometimes the truth is devastating, but silence in the face of evil is complicity. Stay vigilant, question everything, and remember, the most convincing lies are often told by the people we trust the most. If this story of hidden family secrets and Nazi deception shocked you, subscribe for more true stories of families uncovering devastating truths. Share this video to help others recognize that evil can hide behind the most convincing disguises. And let us know in the comments if you've ever discovered something shocking about someone you trusted. Your story could help others stay alert to deception in their own lives.